We're going to take a very good high-level look at the U.S. export control regime, knowing that there is broad extraterritorial reach of these regulations, of the applicable laws and regulations. We'll talk about some key definitions, concepts, classification and licensing, and then look at overall what a comprehensive export compliance program should look like. Okay, so let's dive right in. So why do we have U.S. export controls? I always like to start with this, and I know for a lot of you, you may already be aware of this, but if you were going out and you're spreading the export compliance word, if you will, and trying to market the importance of export compliance, why it's critical for your company, for your organization, it's good to have a slide like this. You know, just letting those that aren't a part of trade compliance know what they're even there for. We have a long list here. At the end of the day, you know, essentially what sort of stands out above all of these is it's about national and regional security. It's to keep essentially your sensitive information or items from falling into the hands of countries, individuals, or entities that are hostile to the U.S. or our allies. That's what it really boils down to. And we, the U.S., are a part of a number of multilateral non-proliferation regimes, so those other countries or a part of these multilateral export compliance regimes that all share the same philosophy, and that is stemming the proliferation of nuclear, chemical, or biological weapons, but again, ensuring that you don't have your items, whatever they may be, your products, you don't have them falling into the wrong hands of the wrong people. Okay, so then when we talk about the regulations themselves and the various agencies that administer and enforce U.S. export controls, there is a long list. So the first step is trying to figure out under whose jurisdiction your products, your technology fall. And again, there are numerous U.S. government agencies that administer and enforce these regulations. But I'm going to talk about today those key or primary regulations that control exports and re-exports out of the U.S. and around the world. So 98% of most U.S. exports fall under the jurisdiction or are controlled by, if you will, the EAR, the Export Administration Regulations. And just putting it in very simple terms, this is the set of regulation that controls all commercial items. You know, those items that don't have a predominant, an overwhelming military application. It also controls those items, though, that are dual use in nature, meaning that they can be used for commercial purposes as well as military purposes. And I think of, let's say, a laptop. You can have the civilian user, like all of us, using a laptop, but then also you can have the military end user using a laptop. That's an example of a dual use item. So those items are also controlled under the EAR or the Export Administration Regulations. And then likewise, there is a very small subset of specific military goods that, based on their technical parameters, don't warrant control under the military regulations, and I'll talk about those in just a second. So again, most of what's exported out of the U.S. and re-exported is subject to the EAR. So I would say most, if not all of you, need to concern yourselves with this set of regulations. And the other nice thing about this set of regulations, which is administered and enforced by our friends at the Department of Commerce, specifically the Bureau of Industry and Security, or BIS, is that there are a number of license exceptions available that seemingly, you may require an export license to export your products or technology to a certain country or to certain foreign persons. We'll talk about that concept in a moment. But there are license exceptions available where if you meet the conditions for their use, you are exempt from having to go to BIS, the Department of Commerce and formally obtain a license. So again, a majority of items are controlled under the EAR, and likewise, a number of exports are exempt from having to or requiring a license for export or re-export because there are these license exceptions available, again, if you meet the conditions for their use. And those conditions and the items that are controlled and named within the EAR can be found within the Commerce Control List. The Commerce Control List is embedded within the regulations themselves, and that Commerce Control List names those items that are controlled or restricted for export or re-export purposes under the EAR. Okay, now let's jump to the less friendly set of regulations, not to discriminate against those regulations, but I think the general consensus is they are far more complicated and more restrictive set of regulations, and they are known as the ITAR, or the International Traffic in Arms Regulations. They are administered and enforced by the Department of State, and specifically the Directorate of Defense Trade Controls. Now, what is controlled under the ITAR? Well, broadly, what DDTC would tell you is those items that are specifically or otherwise named within the control list that is also embedded or incorporated into the ITAR itself, the U.S. Munitions List, or USML. But what does that really mean? What's listed on the USML? What's considered ITAR controlled? They're those items that are A, classified, so under the security label, if you will, of being classified, and more specifically, those items that have an inherent military capability, that the technical parameters are unique to a military or defense application, and here's or an intelligence advantage, so an intelligence technology, if you will, and are almost exclusively sourced from the U.S. These are the crown jewels from a national security perspective. They are considered controlled under the ITAR, so specifically or generally described under the USML because they possess some sort of unique military advantage for the U.S. You know, just a real general example, an F-16, and sometimes parts that go into the F-16 or the Columbia-class submarine, nuclear submarine, and related parts within that submarine. It used to be the case that if anything at all was specifically modified, adapted, designed, configured, etc. for military end use, it was controlled under the ITAR, even those very benign items like a screw where the threading was different simply because it was being incorporated into one of those defense articles like an F-16. That is no longer the case. So again, if you think of the ITAR, it controls those military end-use items and some of their related parts, components, accessories, and attachments, as well as the related technology. That's what's controlled under the ITAR. The other takeaway regarding the ITAR is that virtually everything that is to be exported, re-exported, transferred, and temporarily imported into the U.S. that is subject to the ITAR is probably going to require a license, versus the ITAR is that the ITAR is a far more restrictive and complicated set of regulations, and virtually everything that is subject to the ITAR will require a formal export license or re-export license from DDTC, the Directorate of Defense Trade Controls. All right, now moving on for those that are anxious to hear more. So we have another set of regulations that is administered and enforced by the Office of Foreign Assets Control under the Department of Treasury. Very simply put, they are complicated sets of regulations, if you will, because they are country-specific. There is a specific set of sanctions for exports or financial transactions, dealings with Iran, for example. Again, very complicated because they are country-specific, but essentially at the end of the day, what OFAC administers and enforces are economic and trade sanctions against targeted or specific foreign countries and specific individuals and entities. They have their specially designated nationals list as well as those on the sectoral sanctions identification list for Russia. And these are the individuals, when I'm referring to the individuals and entities, those include those like terrorists, drug or narco traffickers, as well as those that have been found to be engaging in the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, chemical or biological warfare, etc. And, essentially any individuals that are engaged in activities which are hostile to U.S. interests, both, national security and foreign policy interests. So these are the sanctions, the trade embargoes, if you will, essentially, that we have against specific countries as well as specific individuals or entities. Currently, OFAC has economic and trade sanctions against numerous countries, and this list is ever-changing. You turn on the news, and as it relates to North Korea, that's constantly changing. As it relates to Russia, that's constantly changing. But the current list is Cuba, Iran, North Korea, Syria, and the geographic region of Crimea. Sudan, there is a general license or license exception, if you will, for exports to Sudan and certain dealings with Sudan. But that may change. Without getting into too much detail there, I guess I should just say if you're someone that's contemplating exporting to Sudan, you want to keep an eye on what's going on in the news because the status of that general license or license exception that's in place right now may change. Who else do we need to think about? For those of you that may be on the freight forwarding side or those of you that are physically exporting goods or perhaps technology in the tangible form, what's most important on this slide is that you have the Census Bureau that's not only responsible for compiling foreign trade statistics, they also administer the foreign trade regulations, and as part of that, they oversee the filing of electronic export information, or EEI, that is now filed via AES Direct, which has been embedded or incorporated into the overall ACE system. So those requirements are administered by Census and enforced by CBP, and that's the next player in the mix. So CBP, or U.S. Customs and Border Protection, has the authority to inspect, investigate, detain, etc., shipments, request records, and then also, as I mentioned a moment ago, they are also the U.S. government agency that has the authority to issue civil penalties for violations against the census regulations or the foreign trade regulations.